Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. In 2017, Javad Alipoor's The Believers Are But Brothers opened at Transform Festival in Leeds, before transferring to Summerhall for the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, where it won a Scotsman Fringe First and later was adapted for television and shown on BBC 4. This was the first play in a trilogy, the second part of which, Rich Kids, A History of Shopping Malls in Tehran, premièred at the Traverse Theatre during the 2019 Edinburgh Fringe and is about to open at Home Manchester, a venue that co-produced it. A week before it opened, I spoke to Javad at home and asked him to explain what this show, and in fact the whole trilogy, is about.
The trilogy of shows is about the intersection of digital technology and contemporary politics, by which I mean what strikes me as really interesting about like contemporary technology is that as well as like it unleashing sort of new things in terms of how we communicate or devices or stuff like that, contemporary technology seems to be busily unleashing quite old-fashioned things on society, like archaic things that we thought perhaps the 20th century had left behind. So the first part of the trilogy was a play called The Believers Are But Brothers, which was about young men, masculinity, the internet, and extreme politics. And that came out of me spending a bunch of time online, on Twitter especially, and Facebook, basically just kind of like hanging out on the bits of those websites that extremist groups, whether they're so-called violent Islamic extremists, so like far-right Islamic groups like ISIS, whatever, or white Nazi organisations like, you know, on the fringe of the alt-right and that sort of stuff. And the show was kind of about me hanging out in those spaces, a little bit about fictionalised accounts of the kind of young men I met, and a little bit about the history of radical, kind of like the history of millenarian violence and disaffected young men going back through the 20th century. This show, Rich Kids, is kind of different. Well, I suppose part of trilogy, so naturally it's got very different stylistically and a little bit thematically, but it gets its hands on a similar sort of question. So Rich Kids is, in the first instance, tries to tell the story of two young people from Tehran, Hossein Rabbani Shirazi and Parivash Akbarzadeh, who were members of the kind of children of the elite of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Yeah. So the kind of people who might use, there's an Instagram hashtag, so there's an Instagram hashtag, Rich Kids of Instagram, and it's used by people who are all over the world who want to kind of like hashtag photos of, you know, the blessed life that they enjoy. Do you know what I mean? So there's Rich Kids of New York, there's Rich Kids of London, Rich Kids of wherever you like. And I became really interested in the Rich Kids of Tehran, mainly because I thought it was really, really interesting that there's a swathe of countries in the global south, like Zimbabwe, Iran, China, kind of post-imperialist or post-colonial dictatorships, where the people who run them like to show themselves as very sort of severe, austere men who only care about the country and standing up to the West. Yeah. Whatever goes on in Swiss bank accounts, that's what their position is, you know. Yeah. And they show themselves in public in that way. You know, in China, however much fucking money you have in China, you wear the same suit as everyone else does at the top of the Politburo, you know. However much, like in Iran, it's political suicide to show off kind of riches, do you know, if you're a man of politics. But these people's kids, who don't really have a lot useful to do with their lives, they're kind of growing up in a very different circumstance to their parents, do show off what they have, and they have Instagram, and so everyone else can see. And these young people, basically, like at the height of the Iranian sanctions, Hossein Rabbani Shirazi killed himself and Parivash in a car crash in a very uptown, bougie part of Tehran called Neovaran on the Shariati Boulevard, driving a yellow Porsche at about 2 minutes to 5 in the morning. When the Porsche was found, so Parivash was the girl that Hossein was cheating on his fiancée with, from a more sort of middle class downtown background. Yeah. And when the car was found, you know, there's smashed up bottles of champagne everywhere. His Instagram profile then went viral that showed him on, like, whilst Iranians are struggling under sanctions, he's like on holiday in Dubai wearing a solid gold dollar chain and stuff. And I was like looking around at this stuff, and there's some really interesting examples of this all over the world. So Robert Mugabe's eldest son, Chatunga, caused a social media sensation in Zimbabwe just before the coup that brought down his father, because these people do this themselves. You know, he posted a Snapchat video to Snapchat and freezes of it to his Instagram profile himself. No one tricked him into doing it. Of himself in a nightclub, surrounded by whilst sanctions are crippling ordinary Zimbabweans. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. posts a picture of himself, video of himself someone takes, where he flashes his Rolex watch at the camera. We looked into it, and that Rolex is worth about $40,000 US.
Yeah.
And then he takes a bottle of Bollinger, and in front of the camera he pours a bottle of Bollinger over the Rolex watch, like dismissively as if breaking the Rolex, and then puts it on Snapchat and Instagram and hashtags it "Daddy runs the whole country." And so what this play fundamentally does is me and my co-performer Pavan. This is quite a funny story in it, and it's a technical story, and it's exciting. Like Iran, people don't really know what goes on there. There's lots of stereotypes. People don't really know that, like, there's this hot, like, if I went Rich Kids of Saudi Arabia, you'd already know what I meant. But Rich Kids of Iran, there's a bit of an adventure to it. It's like a place to go together. But we use that story, so we tell that story through Instagram, by which I mean, because of the nature of the Iranian regime, these young people's internet kind of imprint was completely taken off overnight after it kind of kicked off. So we've built what we think a kind of Instagram might look like. So we dive into that together. And of course, when you scroll down on Instagram to follow a story, you go down through further and further layers. So the rest of the show is I don't want to kind of throw too many spoilers in, but it's about what happens if you start at one photo of a crash and you keep scrolling down and down forever. And that story then takes in the lives of these two young people, the history of colonialism in the Middle East, climate change, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of content for one show.
yeah. And we do it in about 65 minutes, so your money back.
So how do you get all that into 65 minutes?
Well,
is there a story to it?
Yeah.
Or are you just bombarding us with information?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two sort of ways it works. Fundamentally, we follow the story of Hussein and Parivash from the crash back further into their lives.
Yeah.
And we do that in quite a contemporary way. So us and the audience, we go through that Instagram together. So it's there's some slightly interactive stuff.
Yeah.
And then there are also sections where we share that feel maybe a little bit more documentary, where we share some of our dive into that world back with the audience as well. So I don't really like the phrase documentary theatre, because I've seen it and it's often boring, and so like. But I think it is interesting that there's a bit of a scene at the minute of people, because I think when I say documentary theatre, people immediately imagine like super literal retellings of things, or kind of old-fashioned, a bit more boring verbatim theatre. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But actually, there's a scene now of people doing a little bit more, perhaps theatrical versions of that.
Yeah.
And I hope that our show's like that, really. So it's kind of docky, like in the sense that it's there's some research I've done that we're going to share, but like. Yeah, it's sort of we do that through telling a story. Another
much more old-fashioned term than verbatim theatre I've seen in one or two of the reviews of your work is agitprop.
Agitprop,
Do you think this is a modern version of agitprop?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, man. All of the artistic and creative work I've done is really political.
Yeah.
In the sense that it's about politics and it's sort of suffused with politics. There's really, really interesting stuff in the history of agitprop. There's some terrible stuff as well, but that's true of everything.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But some of that really, really insane, what do you call it? Ambitious stuff in the early days of the Russian Revolution, for instance. You think of Meyerhold restaging the Storming of the Winter Palace a year into the Civil War, and all this kind of mad stuff.
Yeah,
incredible.
That didn't go over so well for him, did it?
No. It didn't pan out all that well over the rest of the career, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, I think my stuff is really suffused with politics, but I think it's suffused with politics in the sense that so I think in that sense, maybe there's an agitprop thing to it, in the sense it's really, really political. But that's just because that's what I find most interesting, to be honest with you. I was political before I was into art. That's who I am. That's what my family background is. I write about politics in other capacities. Like a lot of people, I try and do my bit for the cause I believe in, but where it's probably quite a side difference to the agitprop thing is, I don't think in my work, my plays, my shows, I don't think particularly, there's not a take home usually, there's not a this is the thing that you didn't know before that you know now, or this is the thing that I think you should do. I would say if I knew what that was, and when I know what that was, I'll write an article about it, or I'll stand on the street and do a demonstration about it, or try and get you to do it. Do you know what I mean? And I think that there are more direct, quicker ways of me trying to convince you of something or get you to do something than making a film or a play. Do you know what I mean? Right. I hope with this sort of work, for me, I think what theatre's really good at is not necessarily teaching people things, because for a start, the audiences that come see my work are like, I don't particularly have a lot to teach them. Like, they tend to be very erudite, very plugged in, you know what I mean, people. So like, what I think I can do is take something that perhaps they more intellectually think about and make it something that's to do with your guts and your heart, not just your head. So I
remember years ago I used to do a lot of theatre in education, and some of the research that I saw into the effectiveness of theatre in education was that the theatre's not very good at communicating information. That's better in a pamphlet. But it can sort of humanise it. It can sort of bring it down to earth into human terms. So I suppose that's what you're talking about. So what do you want audiences to take away from it? Are you trying to convince them of something, or are you just telling stories?
I think what I am trying to do is have a conversation with people, to be honest with you. Whether or not it's physically with me, I think that's the point for me, that I think art provokes, and I think art has a slightly different way of contributing to conversations than, if you like, just to use a sort of technical turn of phrase, like than sort of propositional, forms of speaking do. And so like, a show like Rich Kids Rich Kids fundamentally for me is about the question that goes, why are we so shit at understanding ourselves as agents in history? Why do we struggle to get our hands on like I think, we can probably all agree, certainly 60-70% of society can agree that there are world historic questions, like existential questions facing the human race right now. And that we struggle to get our hands on what that means, or to like, so there's some for instance, some people who write about political ecology will say, the more sort of depressive people will say, well, we can't do anything about human created climate change because it's basically the human mind doesn't work on the way that is able to take those numbers and those policy decisions to hand. So like, there's a funny idea that people say human beings are really good at thinking about the passage of time as like 2 or 3 lifetimes. So you to your grandkids, or you to your grandparents, or we're good at eternity. Hence Plato, Muhammad, Buddha, all that stuff. What
it's a bit in between.
It's a bit in between. That's like like 80 actual 1,000 years. What is that? Do you know what I mean? It's the sort of and one of the things that we talk a little bit about in Rich Kids, one of the things we try and get our hands on is like the parallel between, because when I look at these young kids in Tehran, do you know what I mean? What is it that when I tell a story to you about him, Chatunga Mugabe, these kids were. The thing that really, the big irony of their lives is, you see those kids in Tehran, and obviously there was unrest in Iran in 2015, big wave of it, and the Arab Spring's bubbling away in the background in the region and whatever else, and people are like, the Syrians, man, like Rami Makhlouf, who's the richest man in Syria, who's like Bashar al-Assad, one of his like cousins or whatever, dreadful human being, as you can imagine, was, Syria is, it's beyond on its knees. Do you know what I mean? It's a shell. Do you know what I mean? It's the regime there is, I would argue, committed genocide against its own people. It's a bombed out nightmare. Do you know what I mean? And Makhlouf's sons went on like summer break around Europe this year, and Instagram was full of them like in Lambos, Porsches, just careering around Monaco and Switzerland and stuff. And you kind of go, when you look at that, or you look at the Iranian thing, when this, you look at these kids and you go, well, especially in the Iranian context, you're like, how can you not understand how stupid this is? Because you're spending all your dad's money. Where did your dad get his fucking money? Like, he came to power on the back of a revolution against what? Against a corrupt, like a popular, genuine revolution against a corrupt, quote-unquote, overly westernised elite who didn't care about the people. So like, maybe have a little think, do you know what I mean? Maybe think on, pal. And I think that lack of, fundamentally the show's about that, and about how actually there's a funny, entertaining story. Because a lot of my shows sound quite heavy, but there is, what's the point of doing theatre if it's not entertaining, if it's not got some you need some light to see the darkness,
Yes.
All that kind of stuff. So there's like, it's easy for us to look at them and go, how can they not see themselves in the passage of time? But what gets really complicated, then what we get to do together, think about together, and then argue about in the bar, is how are we like that? how can we try and not be like that? Can we try and not be like that? That sort of stuff.
Yeah. So I suppose we can see that in our own societies as well.
Yeah.
I suppose it's more extreme. There's more hypocrisy, perhaps.
Yeah.
Do you think? Because I mean, our leaders, our cabinet in the UK, they're all multi-millionaires in the cabinet, and telling us we've got to stick to austerity for the country's benefits, and it's the poorest that are always suffering these things, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think where it's more the reason I chose a country like Iran and not Saudi, as I say, the reason why I would say Iran, Zimbabwe, China, I would say these, you could talk about Venezuela, countries where either a popular revolution or a guerrilla insurgency at some point in the not too distant past overthrew a regime that was perceived as like, a puppet of the West or like an imperialist regime, and in the name of the people, and in a lot of ways, in Iran and Zimbabwe, the actual people overthrew that. Do you know what I mean? And so that regime is built on. The difference between that and this country is like, in this country you can be a certain kind of Tory, or like Tony Blair, what was it, Pete Mandels's first famous line about I'm intensely relaxed about people being wealthy,
Yes.
That's not like, you can't be intensely relaxed about people being wealthy in Iran or China. It's like, it's not a good look. Do you know what I mean? No. A good look is like, you are a humble man of the people, no one will be left behind. And so that's where the extra hypocrisy comes in. I think where there's it's much more that sort of, in a way it's much more about the hypocrisy of left regimes than it is about obviously wrong uns doing obviously wrong things. Do you know what I mean? Like our sort of cabinet more. I think where there is a little interesting parallel is like in this, almost like one of the other things we talk about in the show a little bit, and one of the other sort of things that the story is about decline, and that's something I think of myself as a left-wing person, and I think people on the left side of the political spectrum, we're not very good at thinking about that. We're much better at thinking about progress. Do you know what I mean? We're much more enamoured of that. The right seem to own decline, you know what I mean? But it's interesting when it's a super theatrical thing. So like, if you think about the rise of a sort of strong, you think about the guys, for instance, who run the Iranian regime. Sure, some of them are like clergy or Mugabe's lot, yeah. Some of them were like the kind of the elite of, as far as you could be elite but not be old regime. Yeah. But most of them weren't. Do you know what I mean? So most of them are people who, like, in their own terms, I always feel weird saying this, but think about someone like Robert Mugabe. In his own terms, Mugabe was a successful man. Yes. Like, he kept, beat the Rhodesians in an insurgent civil war, sat the British down at the negotiating table and basically got what he wanted from him. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Has like a PhD in law. For a bit was like the most successful, like the 80s or whatever, was like the good guy in Africa. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Actually, when he was doing some of his worst stuff, but that was his vibe then. Yeah. Zimbabwe is the breadbasket of Africa and so on. And then and so whatever you think of him, in his own terms, he's a successful man. Yes. But he's this kind of like hard, brutal, successful man. And who's his son? This sort of like useless, coddled, like, I've got loads of Bollinger, sort of like tosser. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I think there's parallels between that and the West, definitely, man. Do you know what I mean? Like, because I always give the example of Cameron. Sorry, I've got a bit of a rant here, but I'll end it here. I always give the example of Cameron. Like, so if any Tory Prime Minister, think about the glory days of the British Empire. If any Prime Minister, Tory or otherwise, had fucked up as badly as Cameron did on the Brexit referendum, like if Cameron's actual, because he comes from that stock, doesn't he? So if his ancestors had messed up that much for the British Empire in the 19th century, they would be off in like Sudan or India, leading some quote unquote heroic charge against some like poor like group of natives or whatever, like making sure they get killed in it to like retain the family honour. Where's Cameron at Latitude Festival? Like, sorry guys, do you know what I mean? And so this, I think there's
a fortune for the advance on his book.
Absolutely, do you know what I mean? Like no sense of shame. I think that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I want to quote that countries that adopt democracy, you get a form of democracy that's based on what was there before. Like Russian democracy is very dictatorial, based on Soviet. But I think that's probably true of non-democracies as well, because if you look at Soviet, that's just as... It was very similar in many ways to the Tsarists before that. Do you think that's the same with the countries that you're talking about, based on the colonial rule that was there before?
For sure, man. I mean, I'm actually quite interested in like post-colonial theory and stuff, and it's of course like the great tragedy in a way of the global South is that the nationalist movements of the from let's say what like probably the early 20th century to about the 1960s, 70s. it's the failure of those nationalist movements. It's like the great tragedy of the global south. And you know, going right back to the 60s, people like Frantz Fanon, the great, who's this heroic doctor from Martinique who wrote an amazing book about the anti-colonial revolutions called The Wretched of the Earth, where he wrote it whilst fighting with the Algerian nationalists who were fighting, you know, a war against the mind-bendingly brutal French occupation of the country, you know, insanely brutal. And he served with them, and cancer was killing him, and he refused to go back to Martinique and wanted to see out the revolution there and so on. And he already warns about what we often forget now is that, like, the goals of those nationalist movements, they weren't supposed to be replacing Western dominance with one-party dictatorships run by a family. That wasn't the dream. That wasn't what people went and fought for. And actually, one of the ways in which you get this great, almost like theatrical irony is, of course, the machinery of state that the liberators from colonialism and imperialism inherit is precisely the machinery of state that the imperialist powers built. So, like, you get, you know, for instance, in India now, the dreadful repression in Kashmir is like almost beat for beat, like that. Literally, the emergency laws that the Indian government have put in place to brutalise the Kashmiris are like laws left on the books from the British Raj for putting down uprisings. And you know, if you can't see that as like a great historical irony and tragedy, like then, do you know what I mean? You don't. But I think sometimes, like, we are still very parochial in the West. You know what I mean? You know, like, people say to me, "Oh, did you make this show? Is this like an Iranian show? You're half Iranian and stuff like that." And I'm like, to be honest, I'm more just like, I try and make work that's about global trends in politics. Rather, I think it's quite sad that, like, we think of, like, the big political plays, we call them State of the Nation plays. I feel like the ambition should be State of the World plays. Do you know what I mean? And, like, we know, us with progressive views, we know we need to put Eurocentrism aside. We know, but then, like, when I say, like, you know, if I say, like, what is most of the world like? Well, most of the world is China and India. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that is, in our guts, we don't feel that.
By a long way, most of the world in population.
Yeah, exactly.
In your research for both of the plays that you've done so far, you've been going into some quite scary places because, I mean, Twitter's not, it used to be quite a friendly place, I remember when I first started on Twitter, but it can be quite hostile. But you've been investigating some of the worst areas of it. I mean, sometimes I have a look at, deliberately going to people that are disagreeing with people that I agree with, just to see where they're coming from. But you're going into the really dark areas. So what was that like? Just talking to people who probably would hate you quite a lot.
I mean, I think what's sort of, like, difficult is to try and, like, walk a path between, on the one hand, like, but just trying to have some integrity whilst you're doing that, which is, like, on the one hand, like, for me, the challenges are, like, it's not my job to, like, what I distrust is, like, this. I think as people who are a bit more sort of, like, I assume, you know what I mean, as people who are more sort of, like, liberal left persuasion, one thing I distrust is, like, the urge to fall over ourselves to, like, quote unquote understand everyone and, like, give everyone a voice when we disagree with them. And I think that way madness lies. Like, and I think if you look at, for instance, some of I think there's a large section of our, like, upper middle class liberal elites who are just, like, intent on committing suicide. Do you know what I mean? You think about, for instance, some of the dreadful stuff that's happened in, like, broadcast media. In fact, you know, New York Times for a brief period, New York Times had a writer with affiliation to the alt-right that they commissioned a couple of times. You know, the BBC putting what's he called, Nigel Lawson, on a par with an actual climate change scientist. Do you know what I mean? Like, balance is going to kill us all if we're not very, very careful.
You're not going to find a climate change scientist to counter the climate change argument, are you?
Well, exactly, you've got to find some moron. Do you know what I mean? Some clapped out, oil-funded moron. Very rich moron. And so for me, integrity is part of about going, like, I am actually who I am, and so I'm not going into any space and being like, oh, I really want to understand how you came to these. I want to humanise you. I don't really want to humanise people. I just want to try and discuss and sometimes lurk, but often, like, see where the meat is, see what their views actually are, see where the points of difference are and stuff with me. And, like, it's something that, you know, I used to be a youth and community worker, and it's like there's, for instance, if you think about the sort of toxic masculinity, there's not a lot of toxic masculinity I haven't heard and tried to challenge in a youth centre in Bradford. Do you know what I mean? In a different context, like. But it's interesting, man. It's interesting to try and make work about that stuff. But in many ways, it's just the job. It's just the work of a playwright or a writer. Actually, it's just, you know, it's like the famous cliche of like hanging out in a cafe and stealing turns of phrase from people.
Yes, but didn't some of the outright challenge you to a debate on Reddit at one point?
They did, yeah. There was
decided not to.
Yeah. There's a bunch of lads who popped up from the, I can't remember the name of the. So I'm sure people know what Reddit is. It's like a more in-depth chat room thing. It's actually kind of cool, Reddit. I think it's got some good stuff on it. Some of it less so. And there's like if you like, they would object to this, but fuck them. a kind of alt-righty subreddit which is dedicated to this thing called Gamergate, which if you see Believers or the film we made of Believers, you sort of know what that is. It's about this moment where a kind of misogynistic hatred against female computer games journalists is like a key moment in a radicalisation of that generation of young white men who make up the alt-right in the US. And this subreddit is dedicated to that. And after they saw like some article about the play when it opened in Edinburgh a couple of years ago, these guys like popped up on my Twitter feed. They're like, "Oh, you should come and have like a live debate with us on our subreddit about this thing." And I just thought it was brilliant. I mean, I made this show like Believers Are But Brothers. It's kind of about Islamic jihadism, but it's also about revanchist, white, sort of Nazi masculinity, and weaving these things together and seeing what's different, what's the same, whatever. And I thought here is a brilliant example of like white masculine, what do you call it, when you expect things to belong to you. Do you know what I mean? Like a privilege. Because I was like, they were like, you've made this show about us, and actually you haven't talked to us directly about it on our. I thought, mate, I was like, pal, it's not about you. Do you know what I mean? Like you're at best like a background character, like for a bit. Maybe in the second bit of the story, but like it's not actually about you. But I just thought like that's what I mean about I'm not falling over myself. I'm not trying to hold myself up as like what I distrust is like I think there's a lot of contemporary theatre, political contemporary theatre, where the artist who makes it hold themselves up as in some way a model or a paradigm of political or moral action, and that's either because they're oppressed or fucked over in some way that the rest of the audience isn't, and then they rose above it, or it's about them sort of testing themselves and being truly tolerant or liberal in a way the audience aren't. And it's not my bag. I mean, I've seen shows like that are good. I've seen some that are less good, but that's not, I think, what the job of an artist is, and it's not what I'm trying to do.
The form of these plays, it uses technology with the audience. It gets the audience involved. You have to keep your phones on.
You do.
Some of the reviews I've written, you can tell the generation that the reviewer's from by reading how they respond to that. How does that work with this show, and how has it gone down with the different audiences?
Well, it's interesting, man. Like, it's sort of like... So Rich Kids has been a little bit more, slightly more generational than Believers. Believers used a WhatsApp group, and everyone's on WhatsApp. Do you know what I mean?
I'm not. Actually.
Are you not? Are you not? There's a quite an interesting thing if you've got like, there's quite an interesting like migrant, second, third generation migrant experience where if you've got a migrant background from almost anywhere in the world, sort of like my white British friends will have an experience of like being on like a family WhatsApp that's like usually their mum, brothers and sisters. And chirp just goes on and you ignore it. But like my girlfriends, we will have one of those, and then we'll also have just this insane group that's like dozens of people who you've never really met. That's like you and just like all cousins back home and all this kind of stuff. And that, you're just like, what even? Do you know what I mean? It's like all aunties and uncles adding their own kids. But WhatsApp is more sort of common, whereas Instagram is like, this new show uses Instagram. Now, in both cases, you know, you don't have to be on that connection to watch the show. In fact, the show really, because I think theatre's really good, theatre is the form of art which is about people being together in space. So one of the things I'm interested in this specific strand of work is digital technology and that kind of mediation. So it's interesting to get some people in a space and some be mediated and some be not. So there's like, I don't think I've ever done a performance of either show where everyone on the audience is interacting through the tech. And that's sort of built into things. But using Instagram is interesting because Instagram is, there's quite interesting generation markers between social media things. So as Facebook usage, the average of Facebook usage has got a lot older recently. And it's now this sort of proverbial, baby boomer vibe. And Instagram and Twitter are the generation down from that. So like their Instagram is quite sort of older millennial sort of a vibe.
It is more female than male, I think.
More female than male. This is the interesting thing about that social media has done, really, in terms of like re-gender parodising the internet. We often forget actually that the birth of the internet is like super female. Do you know what I mean? And then that kind of gets forgotten about.
Yeah.
But yeah, more female than male, younger, and then you go, I joke about like that generation of apps that are younger than that, like TikTok. Like, man, I feel about TikTok how like if my grandma was still alive, she would feel about Instagram.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? No idea what's going on. And that's like sort of kids who are now like 14, 15 who are powering that. But yeah, it was interesting. We it's not so much about how willing you are to like do some shit on your phone, and it's more to do with how much you want to come. I think one of the things we do in these shows, which is a bit like the internet, is we get something that seems interesting, a little story that's just a bit off the corner of your eye, and we research it by deep diving into it, and then the experience of the show, we hope, is like coming on that deep dive with us,
right,
and following that story down and seeing where it takes us. And so that's, in a way, that's like it's about how much people want to come on that thing. And there are like generational differences, but that's as much about how much people want to come on that journey as anything else,
Yeah. And you did a run of this one in Edinburgh.
We did,
yeah. So has it changed at all since then? Since that run?
It has a little bit. I mean, obviously the great thing about theatre and touring theatre is you can sort of like redraft a little bit.
Yeah.
Did you see it in Edinburgh? Or were you
No, I didn't go there this year.
Yeah, it's changed. To be honest with you, it changed a little bit on the run in Edinburgh because that was when we opened it.
Yeah.
So that's where we premiered it and stuff. It was made in partnership with Home, so this is like the kind of home dates, if you like. And I obviously live 20 minutes that way on the tram. And yeah, it's changed a little bit. It's got a little bit tighter in places. We sort of, through doing it for a month, you learn what jokes work and what don't, and you find different things and that kind of stuff. So it's slightly rejigged.
Yeah. And it's the second one in a trilogy.
Yeah.
So the obvious question is,
what's part 3? It's Return of the Jedi, basically. Return of WhatsApp. No, it's. I'm not. I think I'm probably going to make a different. There's a couple of other projects lined up before we get to part 3 of this, I think, but I'm doing a little bit of research on it and stuff, and I think the next little bit of internet culture that I'm interested in getting my hands on is conspiracy theories and magical thinking, and why it is that everyone's a conspiracy theorist now.
Yes.
Like, well, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because I remember when it was weird. Like, I remember when you got your conspiracy theories from the guy you bought your weed from. You didn't get them from like, do you know what I mean? Like your mate's mum.
Well, they spread so quickly though.
Yeah.
That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
They just somebody makes something up and it's around the world within
and actually
days.
across generations.
Yes.
People talk about fake news is worse for the young people who like just use the internet. Actually, if you look at the way conspiracy theories around either Brexit or the Trump election in the US work, that is not the case at all. It's not the case at all.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a really, really strong argument that younger people are much more. The younger you are, the less you believe in the internet. Basically, there's a little bit of stuff about this in Rich Kids actually when we talk about the history of Instagram and stuff. Younger generation people are just a bit more aware of the internet as being the internet, rather than it being a newspaper or a photo album. So there's a really interesting thing, like for instance, like people go, even my generation of people, so like oldest of millennials, if you like, we'll go like, oh my god, like if Instagram existed when I was a teenager, like my life would be over because there'd be all these like embarrassing pictures of me, rah rah rah. Of course, the kids who are actually are teenagers when Instagram's on. So the average amount of pictures that like under 18-year-olds or whatever it's 15-year-olds have on Instagram is like less than 30 pictures at any time. So they put stuff up and then they delete it. They experiment with it just as a form of Instagramming, just as it is. They don't. It's not some massive electronic photo album for them. And if you chat to kids about it, they're like, well, I deleted that photo because that's not my vibe anymore. Do you know what I mean? And we sort of naively think that, even us who grew up with MSN Messenger and, first people to get on Facebook when we were undergraduates and stuff, we like, there's something about the people who are really growing up with it know what it is, are in a way much more cynical about it, whereas the older you get, the more you still start wandering around in amazement at the things it can do.
Yeah. Well, you get cynical about everything when you get older anyway.
Yeah.
But I've seen things about some interesting stuff recently about the psychology of believing in conspiracy theories, and there are people who believe in conspiracy theories. They don't just believe in one; they seem to take in all of them. But now, because there are so many about, you don't know what to believe in. You've got to believe in something, haven't you? So you've got to pick the news. So it's rich picking, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's. I suppose what I'm interested in trying to get my hands on is that grey area. What I'm interested in is how that stuff works, how it spreads, and in some ways I think of my work as quite anthropological. Like how, which is a really quite boring on theatre way of saying it. It's not a lecture, man. It's fine. Like, come. But yeah, that idea of like why, aside from the stories that we tell ourselves, what are actual human beings? Do you know what I mean? Like how do we believe in things? Why do we act the way we do? And that obviously that's just the stuff of theatre classically. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, I think thinking about sort of if you like fake news, conspiracy theories, that kind of, it really brings it out because you kind of go. And it's easy for me to go with a lot of the alt-right conspiracy theories or with these kinds of like pro-Putin conspiracy theories, like the white helmets in Syria, CIA plants, all this kind of nonsense. Like, I can dismiss all that stuff, and I know why that stuff. But it's interesting, like with them. So there's in the US, for instance, there's obviously this big conspiracy about like from the Trump supporters about Pizzagate, which is like this this conspiracy, like supposedly all the elite of the Democratic Party are like involved in some sort of satanic child abuse. Business, do you know what I mean, or whatever, are clearly insane. On the other hand, what's interesting is where you because actual me, if you say to me, is Hillary Clinton the head of a child abusing Illuminati, I go obviously not. If you say is there some dark covert like kind of like satanic paedophile network in the UK, I go clearly not. If you go, and this is where the sort of rot sets in, if you go, isn't it weird that when all the stuff happened after Jimmy Savile, like the only people who anything stuck to who actually done it were people who were dead already? Yeah. I go, yeah, that is weird, mate. Do you know what I mean? And so it's like, what is the... Do you know what I mean? How does it work? Do you know what I mean? What's the way into it? Yeah, and what's the difference between a legitimate sort of suspicion of master narratives, and then that psychotic point where you're so suspicious of what you're being told that you actually believe much more insane things. Than the thing that obviously is the case. And this final part, in a way, like there are certain things that like a big bit of work, like a trilogy of shows, you sort of know some of what it's going to be about, and other things you discover on the way. And one of the discoveries for me has been, if you want to make sort of like contemporary political theatre, and if you want to think about the contemporary political world, you keep coming back to 9/11, and you keep coming back to the response to 9/11, and that sort of floats around everywhere. Do you know what I mean? And so when you think about like with rich kids and like where we stand in history and whatever, you think about that response to it, where the way that we feel like perhaps it's difficult for us to act as historical beings, where we still carry those scars of the big anti-war movement that came to nothing. So what do we do? Like what even am, as they say on the internet, like doing something, And in the same way we think about conspiracy theories, like look, for all the there is a big psychological scar that goes, there was a difference between government cover-up and government propaganda before 9/11 and that moment afterwards where your Bushes and your Blairs directly look the world in the eye and just make up lies.
Apart from this, you do other work as well.
I do.
Is it at Sheffield you did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest?
I did, yeah.
So what's the other work that you do apart from this?
I sort of direct and I write for theatre, so probably the biggest thing that I've done that people might have known me from is this kind of a newish adaptation of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that I did for the Crucible, which was I was their associate director for about a year and a half, and that was my sort of final big project for them. I've written shows, I do a lot of like what you might call participatory or community art in the past. Like I've done did a play that happened in Bradford and at Orgreave for the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Orgreave a few years ago. And lately I've started making stuff for TV and film as well. So the BBC commissioned a adaptation, like a film adaptation of Believers Are But Brothers. So we made that about this time last year-ish. Right. Just, that kind of stuff basically, like a bit of writing, bit of directing. Bit of occasionally talking myself into being in things.
And so is anything else coming up? Is there any more TV? Or?
Well, there's a couple of projects a bubbling, but more on that anon, as they say.
That was Javad Alipoor talking about his new show, Rich Kids, A History of Shopping Malls in Tehran, which opens at Home Manchester on Wednesday the 23rd of October and runs until Saturday the 2nd of November 2019. For more information, see homemcr.org or www.javadalipoor, that's JAVADADALIPOR.co.uk. You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.